I've been threatening to bring in a big farm hammer, deal with them properly. You know, Albert, the old saying, if you don't fit, get a bigger hammer. And then it'll either fit or it'll be out of your life one way or the other.
That's right. I've done it many times.
Speaker, I've passed out, I think you guys have got a copy of a proposal that we're trying to resolve the issue on the stimulus funds. As I understand the bill as it came to us from the House, the school districts could basically, under any circumstance, they've got to spend within the federal limitations. That's clear, I think. But the House would let the school districts spend it basically beyond that any way they chose. The Senate is and could well spend it to make up your 45 million, the 45 million total reduction in the model funding, 100%, if they chose to, under the House scenario. Is that correct? That's certainly how I read it.
So as long as we're clear that the House position takes the 45 million, up to 45 million off, up to 45 million each of the 3 years.
Yeah, each of the three.
Before the distribution.
Yeah.
Before the distribution.
For the distribution.
So to me, at least from our perspective, that takes 135 million off of the table. And that's where I think we have a disconnect
and that
what we're understanding.
135 million is school foundation money that we do not send out within the model.
That is my understanding. And maybe we should have staff. So what I guess what I want to make sure I understand is with the amendment you have, what amount of money do you believe you are applying the 24.6% to?
It is of the American Rescue Plan Act funds that the district gets. And the way that was calculated and didn't prove to be a good way to write the amendment, but we calculated that at half of this 45 million or 22.5 million, so that would be available, because we thought, as we understood the House position, you wanted to have funds available within the federal money that the district could spend outside the confines of our model. Is that a correct understanding of what the House position is?
I think that's a correct understanding, but it's not of the 45 if it's of the remainder, or 45 times.
But that's how I calculate it. So
Just to understand. So, Mr. Chairman, so if I take this, so we have a chart here that staff created. And so in the first 2022, you got 109.2 million. And if you take 24.6% of that, you would be at $26.9 million. Then of that 109 could be spent by the district any way they want. Would that be an accurate reflection of what this is?
yeah, the total, would be, and this adds to the 273. That's right. That's right. And because I don't think the timing per year is guaranteed and the amounts per district are different, translated that into a percentage.
And just, Mr. Chairman, we've talked about, and I don't even know for sure where we're at, but we've talked about splitting this bottom bucket half and half, which would end up being about 32 versus your 27. So that's not that far off either.
Yeah, and we're receptive to negotiating up and down, but it's of the total, and it would not affect the 45 million reduction in the allocation of the school foundation funds, which, as we read the combination of the various other amendments is where we wind up, and we wind up there because that's the maintenance of effort on the state funding.
Can I ask another question, Mr. Chairman? So, Mr. Chairman, just let's assume we have two buckets here. We split that in half or whatever percentage you decide. And I'm trying to understand because I get kind of bollocksed up in all of your language.
Yeah.
So it would seem to me, and rather than define education, essential educational services and do that, it's just with that second pot of money that we're saying, okay, 50% of this bottom bucket districts you can spend any way you want. The other 50%, you're going to have to replace at the local level and put in a reserve account an equal amount. Can we do that?
We could, but why the two different buckets? The 45 million, that's the total reduction in the funding. The total amount of the federal funds is the 109 on this chart. So we were looking at it as a percentage of what I did was calculated off the full amount. And that's where I got the percentage. But it was based on saving half of 45. But
And so
the basis is kind of irrelevant. The percentage that counts.
yeah, Mr. Chairman, just disregard, let's just for a second, disregard the percentage, okay?
Okay.
And let's talk about, so we have a percentage that we have some we're taking off the top, right? That won't get sent out because it's going to become part of their local resource that we're going to be allowed not to provide school foundation for the 45 million.
We're going to reduce the amount of school foundation.
Correct.
By 45 million, which keeps that amount in our school foundation account.
Right. And that's done at the state level.
That's done at the state level.
So now we're going down to the school pot.
The school,
We want to split maybe however we decide to split it, right?
Yeah.
And so let's talk about the pot,
but
not the pot that they can spend any way they want. Let's talk about the other one, which is where your language gets tangled up, or where I get tangled up in your language. You don't get tangled up in your language. I do. So Mr. Chairman, so if we look at that pot, why can't we just say, and maybe this question's to Don or Matt or whoever, why can't we just say districts, that portion, whatever that portion is, you have to put a like amount of school foundation dollars into a reserve account that we're going to hold that you don't have access to until 2025. And then it flows out as a local resource. Can we do that?
I think we can give Matt a minute to think about it before he answers, but I think we can do that. I think we'd be better advised to say it's a pot that's reserved for spending on essential services in the future. I think that waves a few less red flags at the feds. But essentially, that's how we would behave, I think. And I think it's uncertain which year we would draw it down, because we don't know what our state revenues are going to be big time at this point.
So, Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me ask the question of staff. Do you understand what I was asking, and is it doable?
That's, I had to have a number, so we'd have a basis.
Mr. Chairman. We understand where we interpret where the two positions are is the estimated maintenance of effort reductions of the 45 million in section 5 is approximately $135 million. We understand that on both positions that 135 million of the ARP Act funds can be used at the discretion of the school districts to make up any reductions made by either formula changes through health insurance, class sizes, and salary increases, and the maintenance of effort reduction through the state floor. That leaves about 138 million, where I think the negotiation is how much of that 138 million would then go to reserves for future discretion or future expenditure on school foundation programs. And then the balance would be, again, be available to districts to be spent how they see fit within the federal and state program.
Mr. Chairman.
Hold on real quick, Mr. Chairman. Our recommendation is the 273 million is a known quantity. We know how much that is today and how much is going to be allocated. That's that 90% of the 303 million through that allocation fund from the ARP Act. Our recommendation would be to identify an amount of the 273 that you would want to put in a restricted account for the districts for future expenditures on school foundation program purposes. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that's our interpretation of where the two sides are at.
Okay. Now, let me explore that. I think on the House version, there really isn't a restriction on the spending of the stimulus money other than you got to comply with the federals. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
My understanding is on the Senate version, there is a restriction, and all of it except for the maintenance of effort, maintenance of equity at the local level is restricted and has to be spent on things within the model, and then a like amount goes into the reserve account. And what we're seeking with this amendment is a compromise between those two positions.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay. So,
So back, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, whichever chairman.
yeah, whichever.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So back to my question to you two, that's kind of what I said, right? I mean, you could say district, and it's really about a percentage, right? Because they're going to each have a different amount of money. So you could say X percentage of either the big pot or the bottom pot on this thing is going to be put into a reserve account that shall be expended later. And you don't have to define what you're going to spend it on, do you? I mean, I'm asking on, with the best you know as relates to the federal dollars, do we have to define at this time what that money is going to be spent on in the future?
Mr. Chairman, my recommendation would be that the dollars they're moving are what are considered the school foundation program amount dollars. I think it would be appropriate for the JCC report to reference that these are to be used for school foundation program purposes in a future year as determined by the legislature. Something broad enough that foundation program dollars are being utilized on foundation program dollars. And the reason for that is majority of the revenue that is generated is either from the 43 mill levies for school purposes and the investment income from the common school land or common school account. So that's the reason I would recommend identifying for school foundation program purposes.
And Mr. Chairman, the Senate position is, I think, essentially that we use the term essential services and defined it, but when you trace through, that's what it is.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I believe that definition is narrower than that. And if we can make it broader to include what he says, then I'm a lot more comfortable with it, because you've left pieces out of the pie that I think are legitimate spends of school foundation dollars.
And we have done that deliberately because we want to have the state and local resources available to put in the reserves. Now, if you can find a way where they have a little more flexibility, and we still keep that dollar for dollar into the reserves, we can, that's a negotiable thing we could agree to.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
And Mr. Chairman, just if you really look at the language, it says includes the components that are in 21-13-309M. It doesn't say only includes or is limited to. It says includes. So it is broader than I think maybe how you're reading it. I view this to be really, really broad language.
So, Mr. Chairman, if the Senator would actually give us a reference of where in the bill or in Senate amendment you're referring to, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, a follow-up under the definition of essential education services, it means those services required for a complete and uniform system of public instruction as stated in the Wyoming Constitution, Article 7, Section 1, and to provide a thorough and efficient system of public schools adequate to the proper instruction of all youth of the state as stated in Wyoming Constitutional Article 7, Section 9, and includes the components as specified in this section and as modified by 21-13-309M. So I think that language right there, if you look at the amendment, it was Senate Amendment 2. It says includes, but it doesn't have a narrower limitation. But, we can certainly talk about this more, but.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. But then in another section, Mr. Chairman, you go on down to restrict the uses between C2 and C7, if I remember, within the bill, which is a much more stringent interpretation.
C2.
Well, if I'm remembering right, there's enough amendments that I may have got
That's
there.
actually the block grant on education.
That's the categorical block grant.
It's not all of the block grant.
No. And this is intended to catch all the block grant. And so you see, we've restricted it. You've left it open and we're seeking a compromise.
So, Mr. Chairman, maybe there is an interpretation of leaving it open. I don't think that the House position ever was in a place where the 45, the maintenance of effort difference was that needed to be used for the maintenance of effort, which is 309. So maybe there is a misunderstanding between the two positions. But I think that we always anticipated that the 45 was making up for school foundation funds that could be used in a manner that the school districts already have the ability to use them. Understanding that they would be using them within the context of the model because that's money they're getting for the model because we're swapping it, for lack of a better term.
Okay. And my understanding is that the House position was that you could swap that 45 million for federal. If the school district chose to, they could say, okay, we want to spend as if we had that 45, and you're saying yes, but you have to do it with federal dollars because the state is saving this, the 45 million separate. Is that a correct understanding of where you guys were?
Maybe.
And the Senate is saying we agree with you on the 45 million reduction in the state funds. And I don't think there's any dispute about that. And that essentially stays in our school foundation account because it isn't paid out. Then we're saying though, that the federal funding, it has to go for the federal purposes, which are so broad that that's not a problem. But it has to be spent within the financial parameters of the model. Can't be spent to replace any, and it's, remember, it's never specific components. It's the total. It's what they can spend, because that's what we give them. But it can be if you use the federal money as you choose within that block grant, but then you have to put a like amount from state and local into the reserves.
So, Mr. Chairman, back on the definition of educational services, that is simply the components in the model. It does not include food service. It does not include SROs. It does not include other things that
You want to be able to spend.
that whatever they spend money on now that's allowed by our law.
Yeah,
I want that to happen.
and you see, they would, you can say they can do that fine, but they still have to put a like amount of the total stimulus they get into the reserve account for the future.
And Mr.
That-
Chairman,
that would
whatever
be
that
all right.
percentage is, I can agree to that piece, as long as we don't tie up how they spend money currently or with their federal dollars based upon this definition that is narrow. And we just let them spend the money based upon how they
The
can spend
definition,
money.
okay, definition is how they get the money. But if you're willing to go with the dollar for dollar thing, we can modify the language to accommodate your point of view, I think. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, maybe we just got to see it out written out.
Mr. Chairman, I think part of this is we don't have maybe a good example of what we're trying to achieve. I think, this isn't their entire budget. This is a sliver of it. And so when I think about, if you wanted to buy an HVAC or shuffle some money around with food services, this restriction is on such a narrow percentage of a district's entire budget that it frees up some ability in other areas of the budget to do probably maybe some of the things that you're looking to do. So that's where I'm a little stuck on, this isn't their entire budget and we're tying their hands. We're tying the hands on a very small amount. No more than 10% would be my guess. I haven't plugged it in the model, but I'm guessing it's no more than 10% per district. That'd be my guess. Is that fair?
This federal funding,
Correct?
So
it is on an annual basis, it is in the 7-8% range.
Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, and if I could get Matt to go, if you go to page 69 and we look at, I have it written down as Senate Committee of the Whole Amendment number 3 that modifies subsection B. And I think that's where the bill ended up. And it says on this, and I would have to go back into the green books, but Matt, I know you'd know. The school foundation program amounts allocated to school districts under 2113-309P, I'm not sure what that is, shall only be expended for essential education services as defined in 2113-309-1B2 created by this act. And so that I'm sure is the definition, but I don't know what 2113-309 is. So if that is the entire block grant, then anyway, what is that?
Mr. Chairman, look on page 2, section 1, WS 2113-309.1 is created to read. It's the first 48 pages was attachment A.
So Matt, 2113-309P.
Mr. Chairman, that is what we refer to as the school foundation program amount or the school foundation program guarantee. That's the $1.5 billion, which includes reimbursements. It's all the model components.
So Mr. Chairman, that's my point. You restrict what they can currently spend. in that statement on the program, on the guarantee. And that's, that's that's just a kind of a bridge too far for me, Mr.
So Matt, if I could, just to clarify, Matt, if I could, P includes all funds, not just the state side of that. So it does include local resources as opposed to what was represented earlier. This would only impact a small part of it. This actually, by the language here, impacts the entire state, all the monies that go to educations. Is that correct, Matt?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Thank you.
So we're using all the language to define that we use for the model to define the essential education services was what happened.
Your language.
Yeah.
Our language.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chairman, if you really went back to your definition of wherever that definition is.
It's in two places.
Yeah, right here, Mr. Chairman, on page 4, I think. And if you look at, if really it's the bottom part, if you open that up and don't just say it's the components, but if you provide language like Matt had in suggestion with the pot of money, is that anything money can be spent on by districts currently, then I think we're okay. It's that we're tying it up too much.
Well, I think it does exactly what you described. That it was by catching that, all that, it's essentially catching all the things you spend money on. They're all within the model. And the model is the total amount of funding that you get.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, the program guarantee, basically you tie how you can spend your guarantee to this definition of essential education services, which is only that portion that are the components in the block grant. And by, there's a few things outside, right? It goes on and refers to special, if you go follow the statutes, it catches special ed and all that, but it doesn't allow for food service, SROs, and there could be other things. Just don't know.
To be clear, the way I understand listening to the discussion with staff is it doesn't allow those for any part of the money, not just the state part of the money or the federal part of the money, local resources, anything, period.
All of it.
Are we having a misunderstanding, or is what I'm understanding correct with that? Somebody.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
Lifeline.
Section 6B in the Senate amendment restricts the school foundation program guarantee to be only spent on the components identified in this act, which does not, the block grant funding model does not allocate an amount for food service programs, does not allocate amounts for school resource officer. I think that's what Representative Summers is identifying, some of the limitations that school districts currently supplement part of their food service programs through transfers from their general fund, which includes the school foundation program funds, or contract services for school resource officers, which are not a component of the block grant guarantee. And so this section restricts two things. It restricts the school foundation program amounts, and it also restricts the ARP Act funds allocated to the districts.
Mr. Chairman, and I there's other examples. I'm just not a school person, and I know that there's some districts that provide some help to early childhood programs. I don't know if that's out of their block grant, but if they do provide some of that out of the block grant, it would preclude them to be able to do that. It just, Mr. Chairman, it's too big a net.
Okay, so the key in here, the key thing for us is the dollar for dollar transfer. And I think if we can go with that, then we can deal with the language. Is that where we're trying to go? Because what I was trying to get was to keep it from being spent where it didn't get offset. But if, as long as they have to offset what they get out of their state and local resources and put it into a reserve for the future, we can operate with that.
I still think, Mr. Chairman, so I still think that we're still constricting the current spending of ability of districts with their entire foundation amount with this language, period.
Well,
Correct, but I think, Mr. Chairman, I think the good chairman is saying, if what we want to get done is hold that money, then we create the language to facilitate that, and we don't worry about these definitions so much anymore.
yeah,
Is that what?
that's what I'm saying, that if we're gonna offset all the federal money that they get, so it has to be spent within the federal guidelines. But then that total amount, they have to put, say, just an example, a school district gets in any particular year, $2 million of ARP funds. They have to put 2 million in a reserve account that's restricted to spending on, as if it were part of the model going forward.
And Mr. Chairman, just a question back to you. So, you have this 24.6%, which, we may negotiate on that too.
Yeah,
correct?
oh yeah.
Right. So
So
There's-
because what we thought was that you guys wanted it even wider open, what they could do with it, and they didn't have to put a dollar for dollar in. And so that was trying to compromise that. But if you're willing to put a dollar for dollar in, we go for that in a hurry.
well, I think, we need to discuss all of that and I'll leave it to my chairman, but I mean, we need to figure out amongst us what this 24.6, and if we can get rid of your constrictive language and just worry about trying to fill the pot of money, the reserve
Yeah.
accounts, and I think we can maybe
Yeah,
get some.
if you see the language that I provided you there, it's 24.6% of the American Rescue Plan funds, which is school district. Yeah,
Mr. Chairman, so just to be clear, though, the rest of the sentence or the rest of the
yeah,
says outside of the essential education
Yeah.
services requirement. So that means by, at least by my definition, that everything else, the entire rest of the school
Okay.
foundation program
and if,
is all inside the definition you have. I think that's the disconnect, is the definition provides all the restriction and we're going to give them just this little sliver to go outside. That's where for the house
For-
side, that's where the hang up is.
okay, that's where, yeah, so if you say, except for 24 6/10% of the American Rescue Funds, which a school district receives, and then cut the rest of it out, would that work for you guys?
That's getting closer. What we have to see though, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think Senator Ellis said it, let's start with the bricks we want and build it and then hand it over to them to do it. But I think you're getting closer. What do you think, Representative Simpson?
I do. The restrictive language in one of your amendments just needs to be either removed and replaced with, we're really close. I think we're on the right concept. We're just choking down on
Yeah.
one concept here. And so we just need
Yeah.
to get past this and move
And-
on.
If we take that all the way down, and just say that we'll get rid of the language and say that, if they get it from the American Rescue Plan Act stuff, that we offset that dollar for dollar into a reserve account. Does that take care of it?
Yeah, we'd have to see the language. And Mr. Chairman, of that we don't give them to spend, right? The 24.6 or 30 or whatever number we come up with, there would be a pot of money they can spend any way they want. That's left, that other pot, goes dollar for dollar slides into a
Yeah,
reserve.
and,
And it'll be based on percentages because they each get a little different amount.
yeah, it has to, percentages of what has to be to work.
Mr. Chairman, to be clear though, we're talking about 24% of the ARPA money. At
Yep.
least my view is we're still restricting the entire rest of the school foundation program by the essential
Well, and that's
services.
what we're saying, if we can, that was designed to make sure the money was there to be transferred. If we say we're just going to do an automatic transfer, we don't need that other language.
We'll accept that.
Understand?
Josh, did you get any of that kind of?
Mr. Chairman, just, I think Representative Summers said for school foundation program purposes. I don't know if you came up with that term or if that was something that maybe LSO came up with, but I'm wondering if that would be the solution. Instead of removing the language, instead of removing essential services, just swapping that term for school foundation program purposes. If that gets us closer there, that's what I want to know.
Yeah,
So, Mr. Chairman, and I don't know how, I think we can simplify all of this if we are not worried about that definition, other than to just say you could spend it on school foundation. There's some other pieces in that definition I'm uncomfortable with. You're citing the Constitution and statute. I don't think you need to do all of that. That's outside
That
the,
was trying to dress it up in case we have a court
I
judge.
realized what it was. And yeah, I don't buy that one, but that one's not, doesn't, yeah.
It's not essential.
It's not essential. That's right.
So if I could, Mr. Chairman. So Josh, do you think is there an understanding between Josh and Don and Matt, what we're trying to accomplish here? We're trying to actually flip this a bit, flip this to untie the school foundation program, give them latitude within a portion of the federal funds, and then restrict a part of the federal funds that we're trying to actually capture. Are we collectively on the same place here?
Mr. Chair, I think so. Let me just repeat back what how I understand it. And Mr. Anderson and Mr. Richards can correct me if I'm off base, but how I interpret this direction is remove any amendments to section 1 in the first couple pages related to the definitions and of defining essential education services. We would bring back proposed language that identifies a percentage to be yet to determined of the American Rescue Plan Act funds allocated to school districts to be a dollar for dollar match into a restricted reserve account to be further directed by the legislature for school foundation program purposes.
Further, may I make a suggestion there? Not directed by the legislature, further used for school foundation purposes. I don't want the feds picking on that phrase and saying, oh, you violated your state maintenance of effort.
And Mr. Chairman, we could certainly do that. And we would also further restrict the transfer amount to ensure that each district still maintains their maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity requirements under the federal laws.
Yeah, we need to do that.
That, Mr. Chairman, that's the guarantee. You just put it in there that they have to do that maintenance of effort. And so if there's a reason they can't transfer this amount of money because of maintenance effort, then they don't have to do it. If there's a,
Yeah, if they have to have the federal money for maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity. And is it not fair to say in representing this to the floors that we do not at this point understand what those requirements will be? And so that's an uncertainty.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's accurate. And when you negotiate your certain percentages, we would recommend, again, using the 273 million as your denominator.
The full 273.
So we know, how much of that 273 you want to allocate to the reserve account.
So if we negotiate based on we figure it based on the 273. And it'll be then there'll be a uniform percentage across all the districts, no matter how much they get.
So, Mr. Chairman, so I guess I want to make sure I'm clear because I think we're actually doing the same thing with all the money now. So if we take out the definition of essential educational services, which returns it to the current ability to use money in any way you wish. And we adopt this language that says may be spent outside or essentially for school foundation program purposes. It's all going to the same place. It's all completely unrestricted. At least that's what I'm interpreting us by taking out the essential services, educational services, and doing this. I think we actually need to flip this percentage dollars and say this can only be spent within M, whatever the right numerate is. So I just throw that out there that I think we just said now all 273 and the rest of the school foundation program can be spent as it currently is, current law. And we're doubling down on it with this 24 currently in the current proposal, 24.6%. Is that just to be clear, is that I want to understand where we are with removing the definition, opening up the entire school foundation program to the latitude it currently has, and then saying, oh, that why you can do that with this amount too. I mean, maybe I'm completely backwards, but I want to understand that. Thank you.
I think you got it right, except I think we flip it. And it's a percentage that you have to put in the reserves.
Right, that's
Yeah,
the
I just want to
reciprocal.
know where we're.
Yeah, I just want to know. That's what I'm saying.
So, Mr. Chairman, you could, under the proposed language that Chairman Scott provided, just under that proposed language, you could say, 74% goes to the reserve account, dollar for dollar, or 24% can be spent as allowed under the school foundation program.
I just want to be clear what we're getting.
So, Mr. Chairman, and this is a question to Matt. So, I know Matt or Dawn, you guys have this chart, right? This is the 45 million gets taken off the top, right? So 45 million, we shift, we don't provide school foundation dollars. And they assume they have to use those as local resources, correct?
Right. So, Mr. Chairman, what I would suggest is of the 273, if you want to take 135 off the table, that's, just going to lower your percentage amount that would be moved to the restricted reserve account. So if you're only looking at the bottom row or the second row with the big boxes, I think that is the amount that is in question, whether or not, how much of that do you want to go towards a reserve account or be utilized by districts based upon the federal and state program.
And my suggestion to my cohorts has been, it's a half and half, so 32 million. And so, but that's a percentage that we yet to be determined. But I think if we spend our time looking at that second bucket and figuring out what percentage we want which way, it just makes more sense in my mind how to look at it.
Frankly, I get lost there. I think that the original advice, do your percentage of the total 273 is the best way to figure it. And then the significance of these buckets drops out.
And Mr. Chairman, just to that point is the 45 or whatever that number is taken care of by the maintenance of effort, 90% maintenance of effort issue. So whatever that number is already taken account for. So I think you can go to the total number you chose to. I would ask though, if the 80% that's in section 5, because in section 5, we actually have 80% versus now we're talking 90% of the total. So actually change that 80 to 90 now to accommodate that, because the maintenance of effort, that is part of that, at least that initial drawdown, or we're saying they already have open use of 20% with that language. So do we need to accommodate that in some way in this formula, in this formulaic approach?
Mr. Chairman, looking at it says the maximum reduction under this section, which is section 5, school years, et cetera, shall not exceed 80% of the total amount allocated to the districts under section 201. So that's 80% of the 273. And 80% of 273 is roughly 220, 218,
Mr. Chairman, 218.
218. And the total reduction over those 3 years is 135, so it isn't close. And it meets that test.
And Mr. Chairman, you know, they're going to get us some language and we have like 10 minutes before we got to gavel in, or 15. And I'm wondering if we want to move on to the other items before we.
And so I just respectfully say back to the chairman, then on that 80%, maybe it should be 40%, because that gets us a lot closer to the 35 or 45,000, then what's remaining. That way you distribute that over 3 years and you're not pouring it all out in potentially 1 year, i.e. with 80%. Thank you. And any thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, as long as it's well above the 45, it doesn't make any difference. And it's not a difference between the two houses. So why bother changing?
All right. So let's keep going with other items. I think maybe we have some language that we can work on to sort that out a little bit. So other things that came out of, we had the school foundation, i.e. within the model, categorical and teacher salary, et cetera. And then the revenues things. Anything we want to touch on those two items?
The revenue ones is, I think, where the contention is.
Well, tell us what your offers are.
Sherry?
Well, first of all, I was thinking that Representative Summers could, oh, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was hoping that Representative Summers could take us through his chart that he provided. We had a quick run through by one of our good staff members, but I was just hoping you could take us through that really quickly.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just really quickly, and there was kind of a.
Which one? Get on the same chart.
Okay, so this was the newly created chart that, backside. And so you will see on the 1% severance in the House proposal at the bottom. It was my intent to go the first year in 2023, 2022, we leave it alone like the budget has it. 2023, it would 50% would go to the school foundation program reserve account, because we don't want to show an increase in the general fund of education. On the bottom side, it was not my intent to go to the reserve account. It was 50% to the permanent account. So straight into the permanent account. And then that would carry on the next year in 2024. Instead of going to the school foundation program reserve account, it would just go to the school foundation program. And then that would carry on forever, 50% to the PTMF, 50% to the school foundation program. And then on the LISRA refuel, we went to 2/3, and you can see that the House proposal, 1/3, 1/3 LISRA's on top, which is 1/3. 2/3 is the school foundation program reserve account in the first year in 2022 and 2023. And no, 2022 and 2023. And then it went 2/3 school foundation program for the rest of time. And so that's kind of what it is.
And Mr. Chairman, could you take us through those dollar amounts too, as far as what we're looking at, dollar and cents wise on the total effect?
I think it's easiest to look at the second chart, which is assuming a high level projection. Yeah, the bottom chart, assuming that you reach your 5% investment, we're actually guaranteeing it. So some of that would be guaranteed, some of it wouldn't if you run out of your reserve account. So, so if you look basically down at the bottom row, because that'd be 2026, you can kind of see how everything's flowed in over time. And the JCC proposal out at about 2026 is going to save you about 154 million on the shortfall of education. And remember, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 million shortfall on the program side of school of K-12 and 50 Capcom. So that's kind of the projection of how the numbers would play out. The House position, obviously, in that corner was we'd pick up a 0.5 cent sales tax out at the end. And so you would see a 95 million come in somewhere later, and that would be the 212. And you guys were at 45 million, all in reductions. So we started out with 212, you started out with 45, and we're trying to get to 153 just through the diversions with no tax.
So back to the back page, the 50% would go to the permanent mineral trust fund, not the reserve account. So that was the technical correction. Okay. So we talked quite a bit about this over what we had before lunch, and we were talking about possibly diverting all of the 1% severance tax into the common school land permanent fund for education, so that we could provide a revenue for future generations and build up the corpus and use earnings off of that. Is that anything that you have considered, or would that be something you would consider?
And Mr. Chairman, just to add, I think that the view and the thought would be that would be a multi-year, 5 or 6 years
Yes.
diversion.
I think 6 was what we talked about. Thank you for that, Senator Ellis.
And Mr. Chairman, obviously we'll go back and talk about any proposal that you guys bring. You didn't mention anything about the LISRA refuel, so I'm not sure where you're at on that.
I don't think we contemplated the LISRA refuel being a part of that.
So Mr. Chairman, so you would take the LISRA refuel and leave it with the LISRA.
That's what we were talking about. And the reason being is because that already backfills K-12, and we felt like that was being provided for already. And so it's just a different way of doing it. We recognize the creativity there. However, we kind of prefer what we've been doing because we know how it works and we can see it for transparency's sake.
And so, Mr. Chairman, the problem is that we'll always profile a deficit for education until either you do a tax, you do diversions and put it right to the SFP, or you do cuts. And so if you never recognize that hole we have, then there'll always be a deficit, and there'll always be an insistence to fill that deficit with cuts and not something else. And so if we're not willing to tax, then I think it's really important that we put some of these diversions straight into the school foundation program.
And we would resist that. Frankly, my position is that putting it in the LISRA is fine. And that's the LISRA and the general fund somewhat equivalent. And we fund the schools out of that. Having lived through the previous downturn, where we routinely funded schools with general fund, I see no objection to doing it that way. And I think the schools will be under the reduction pressures that hit the general fund under any circumstance.
Yeah, and so, Mr. Chairman, I mean, we'll take your proposal back, and I mean, maybe we talk it over and we consider something like putting the full severance into the LISRA for all time.
You can't put it in for all time because the next legislature will change it.
Right. I
Yes.
mean, the next, obviously,
Say you are, but
appropriations will grab that revenue flow and do whatever they want with it whenever they want. But it's still, it's always a bone of contention when and it became very clear in our budget discussions this year that, it's intended to go to the permanent account. And so there's always this push that it has to go there. We have to find some revenue for K-12 education. We cannot ignore that.
Mr.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think, Mr. Chairman, the theory of putting it in the corpus of an account is just to provide longer term stability rather than diverting it to spend it. I think that's the theory we're trying to work off of, and something that the Senate advocates for and is a strong feeling among us.
And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that look to the future, but we have a need now.
And Mr. Chairman, and those are all valid concerns, and I appreciate you bringing them up. But we also have to consider the fact that we have a diminishing source of revenue as we look to the future. And so if we don't plan for the future and put some of that away to increase that revenue stream off of our earnings, then we're just in a catch-22 there. So we're trying to find a creative way to accomplish what you want to accomplish the long-term goals that we have as well. And I know you guys have considered those things as well, because I've been a part of those discussions. And so that's kind of where we're coming from now. We can definitely consider LISRA and what we might do there if we need to beef that up a little. We'll look at any proposals that you have for us as well. I think too, though, as we look at the budget reductions we had to make on the general fund this year, there is a thought that the ARP funding has come in and kind of skewed things on this side of the equation, and we haven't seen the ability to maybe do some of the reductions that we had hoped to kind of balance that out as we looked at our DD waivers and all of the things that we had to reduce. So for right now, that has really filled in a gap for us, and we're appreciative of that, but looking to the future, we may not have that luxury, so.
So to be clear, Mr. Chairman, so I think you have your proposal before us. If you want to write out what your proposal is or what your counter is, we'll take that up. And I'd suggest 3:30 as a reconvening time to see if we're going to move further or not. And I think we should just be honest with each other. If we're not going to move further, we maybe have some language to deal with the federal money. I don't know that we're going to get anywhere on the revenue diversion thing. And if there's something we need to address in the program, in the school, in the program tide, let's get that out maybe first when we get back, when we come back together. If there's something in there between salaries, those three things, and then let's go to this one next. And then if we're not going to come to there, we'll make a call then, whether we continue.
And we still have to meet on it, but the other idea I've thought of, if you're dead set on going to the corpus, then that school, that K-12 flow, you split half of it to the corpus and half of it to the program. So in other words, you would come to some middle agreement on that. But I think if your intention is just to go straight to the corpus with all of it, I don't know that we're going to have a deal.
Okay, we understand.